In California, lawmakers are trying to stop scams against undocumented migrants before they happen, as calls for national immigration reform grow louder. A new bill would limit practicing immigration consultants who have been convicted of committing fraud. These consultants file forms for clients, but when done incorrectly, can lead to dire consequences. A new report takes a closer look at what the state is doing to get ahead of these potential scammers and what the renewed push for reform could mean for migrants and consultants. So Nadia Lopez is the Latino communities reporter with the Fresno Bee. She's joining us now to talk more about her report. Thank you so much for joining us, Nadia. So first off, tell us what notarios publicos are. Who are these people, and how do immigrants become victims when trying to get help from some notary services in California?
Hi, happy to be here. So notarios públicos are people who pass themselves off as immigration consultants or attorneys. In Mexico, the term is more akin to a legal professional or an attorney. So here in the States, in California, some people use that to their advantage to deceive immigrants who are looking to correct their documentation status. So what often happens is that a person will make a false promise that they can resolve their immigration issues or documents, and will charge exorbitant fees. They'll never complete the paperwork. Or if they do complete the paperwork, they may often submit the wrong application. In those cases, that's when they can get into some serious trouble, the people applying and the sponsors that they have as well. So that's often involving their family members, as well as the individuals who are seeking to correct their documentation status.
So Nadia, explain to our viewers what you said that they can get into trouble. What are some of those dire consequences for people who find themselves caught up in this?
Yeah, of course. So what could happen is that if a person files the wrong paperwork, say you don't qualify for asylum and somebody files an asylum application on your behalf, or encourages you to lie about how long you've been in the country, or if you've left, or if you've come back, whatever some of those more legal questions may be, then you could potentially, an individual could potentially be convicted of perjury. And if that's the case, it could be kicked out of the country for 10 years before they're allowed to return.
Yeah, I think, if you've never gone through the immigration process, and I've gone through the immigration process, not the asylum process, there's a lot of paperwork. You sort of submit it and send it off. It takes months to find out what the status is. If there are any errors at all, the process has to restart. And, if that continues too long, then your status, you may be sort of out of legal status. You may no longer have permission to be in the country. So it's very important to be sort of accurate and precise, not to mention, a lot of this stuff costs money. And so if you have to sort of keep reapplying, it can get very, very expensive. California State Senator Ana Caballero, she's spearheading the reform to tackle immigration fraud in Sacramento. What can you tell us about her latest bill?
Yes, so Ana Caballero, who is a representative, represents parts of Merced and Madera counties here in the central San Joaquin Valley. And so this isn't her first time proposing some sort of, reform on the immigration consultancy business. Her latest effort, SB 670, would put new limitations and restrictions on what immigration consultants can do. So specifically, it would get rid of the term immigration consultant, and instead it would rename them to form preparers. And this was an intentional move that she says, help diffuse some of that confusion tied to what work and the scope of the work that they're allowed to do. So this is different from her previous bill, AB 638, which would have gotten rid of the business altogether. And that failed to get enough support in the past because there were a lot of both Republican and Democratic legislators who weren't comfortable putting small businesses out of business.
So immigration-related fraud has been an issue for some time in the city, specifically of Fresno. I mean, tell us what it is about Fresno in particular that has led to that, and what are city leaders doing to combat this? What will their work assist in what the states are hoping to do?
Sure. Yeah. Well, Fresno is, the dominant minority here is the Latino community. About half of the city is Latino or identifies as Latinx. And much like the rest of the region, this is a heavily agricultural region. You have a lot of seasonal workers. You just have a lot of people that have, over time, the diaspora of the Latin community has just come here. And so it's a really rich and vibrant place. But unfortunately, with larger immigrant demographics and populations, people take advantage of that. And often it's farm workers or people working in the ag industry that maybe don't have the same levels of educational attainment, or maybe English isn't their primary language, or the immigration process in itself is already so confusing. So they're the ones that are most susceptible to getting defrauded. And so local lawmakers here at the city council level have been attempting to kind of crack down on some of these scams. And they're trying to build on the statewide bill, specifically by initiating new penalties and new kinds of criminal punitive measures as well for people who are committing these scams.
So if the bill fails, is, sort of what's the next step? Is it up to kind of municipalities or cities to kind of figure out their own way to crack down on this stuff?
Yeah, well, so the current law mandates that all individuals pay a $100,000 bond, register with the Secretary of State, and show that they have no criminal record, so by passing a background check. The caballeros are these so-called consultants that they often ignore or don't comply with these rules. So the local ordinance can still try to enforce the existing rules, say if the statewide bill doesn't pass. But if it does pass, then they'll be able to go an extra step further.
Such important reporting.
And Nadia, I'm wondering if,
Yep.
Just a sort of a quick question, Vlad, just within the community, how much of an awareness is there that there are people like this out there that either are deliberate scammers or are presenting themselves as more professional than their abilities? Is the community trying to sort of police internally?
So that's a really interesting question. The thing is, it's really hard to pinpoint specifically these scams because not one fraudulent immigration consultant looks the same. So as I spoke to one attorney who told me that basically, and an immigration consultant herself, who told me that, people may sometimes intentionally or unintentionally file the wrong forms. And sometimes people who, portray themselves as immigration consultants, they file the right forms. Sometimes that happens. So when that does occur and a person does gain their, legal documents through this individual, then word of mouth spreads. And then it becomes more trustworthy. And then that's when, it spirals and all these other problems occur as well. So within the community, people are more likely to trust those that they know, friends of friends, family friends, conocidos. And this often, kind of causes problems. But many of these people who are scammed are so afraid because they don't have their documentation status, or it's also pride. Some people feel embarrassed. Some people feel ashamed that they were the victims of scams, so they're less likely to report it.
Right, makes sense.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating story, and it's so striking because the Central Valley of California, for going back to the time of Cesar Chavez, was such an important part of the vibrancy of California, and so many of the rights that immigrants were able to win were in part due to the efforts by Chavez and others of the time, and it's so disheartening to hear that something like this is happening even now in 2021, Nadia.
Yeah, it is unfortunate. And, throughout my reporting on this very important community, we've been through the coronavirus pandemic, and they're considered essential. They perform work that often people born in this country don't want to do. And yet, much like so many other issues, they often receive the short end of the stick when it comes to achieving just basic things that, many of us take for granted.
Well, it's important to have your reporting.
I think,
Sorry.
A good chunk of it, Vlad and Nadia, is that it's a complicated process and it's an expensive process, and I think that if you are a citizen, if you're born here, you have no idea. And I remember when I was kind of going through the process myself, I would sit in the waiting room, my attorney's waiting room, surrounded by people, many of which did not speak English, and I would wonder, how are they navigating this? Because I could not navigate it on my own at all. And when the process is that complicated, it leaves space for people who can offer shabby services for much cheaper, it's very expensive, or it leaves space for scammers who will take advantage of people who are desperate. And I know, Vlad, you were about to say, so that's why it's really important to have the kind of reporting that you're doing, Nadia. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.